Okay, guys, I'm going to record for you some notes on Chapter 10 on elections and campaigns. Please make sure you read this in your book too, and I'll post some reading questions for you to follow along with, but this will kind of be the overview of elections and campaigns. So we're talking about different types of elections in this chapter. So primaries and midterms and presidential elections, with a heavy focus on the primary elections and the ways different states choose candidates for office. Okay, so some key terms that you'll want to know. The electorate, that's just the voting population, so just the people who are going to be voting. And then mandate comes up a lot. Mandate is important. We talked about this in the federalism chapter, as in something that the federal government is ordering the states to do. This is mandate in a different term or in a different context. In this case, mandate refers to the idea that if a candidate wins in office by a wide margin, they're said to have a mandate or basically leeway to implement their policies. It's if they have a wide margin of victory, they believe they have a mandate or a right to implement the things that they talked about during their campaign. Okay, so primaries. So we have different types of primaries. The umbrella term here is direct primary. So any election where voters are deciding which candidates within a party will represent that party in the general election. So it used to be that political parties were much stronger and party leaders would sort of gather and decide on, who the candidates were going to be. Well, that's no longer the case. Now every state, most states have a primary. Some states still have a caucus, notably the Iowa caucus. But it's just this idea that voters get to go to the polls and decide who's going to appear on the ballot for the general election, although voter turnout in primary elections is much lower than that in a general election. Types of primaries, so open versus closed. So Missouri, here we have an open primary. And what it means to have an open primary, I think I get to that on the next, no I don't. Okay, so the open primary means that anybody can vote. You do not have to be a registered member of a party. So in Missouri, you show up to the primary, you ask for either the Republican ballot or the Democratic ballot. So you have to choose, but you can vote in either party's primary, and then you pick the candidate from there. Closed means that you have to be a registered member of a party in order to vote in the primary, and then you can only vote on that party's ballot. Most states have a closed primary, so Missouri's in the minority here. I'll post a map for you on Canvas. A blanket primary is where you have all the candidates appear together regardless of party. So California does this. They put all the candidates on one list, and you can choose any candidate for any particular position regardless of party. And then a runoff primary occurs when none of the candidates secure a majority of the votes. This only happens in 8 states, but it's a way for those states to ensure that some candidate gets the majority of the votes. So those are just terms you might hear about types of primaries. And then, of course, we have the general election, which is choosing who's actually going to hold office. Election day this year is November 6th. So, of course, you guys are well aware that we've got a big Senate race here in Missouri. So, yeah, voters deciding which candidates will actually fill elective public offices. General elections will have positions that are open at many levels. So you've got municipal positions, county, state, and national elections, and it's all the general election. This is notable. The differences in the voters, so who turns out to vote between a primary election and a general election. Typically, primary election voters are those that are paying a lot more attention. They tend to be more extremes in their parties. Not that they're extremists, but they just tend to be more ideologically aligned with one of the two parties, because like I said, in most states where there's a closed primary and you have to declare or be a registered member of the party, the people who are going to register with the parties are those who are very dedicated, who are very sure of their ideologies. So you do see a little bit, voters who are more left or more right than voters in the typical general election. So candidates then have to respond to that, and candidates will tend to be typically a little bit more ideologically extreme during the primary to attract those voters. Plus, when you have, 16 Republican candidates, the candidates have to stand out from one another in some way. So they're being compared as to where they are, how conservative are they, how right are they. So they're trying to compete for those limited voters. And then in the general election, they tend to kind of change their message a little bit, lean more center to attract more of those more moderate general election voters. Some other terms that come up that have come up on the AP test in the past. During the election, you may also see opportunities for citizens to sort of engage in direct democracy and creating public policy. These are things like the initiative. So if citizens can propose legislation or they can propose a constitutional amendment, this happens a lot in Missouri. You've probably seen people collecting signatures. They do it in public places outside the library or outside the DMV or something. They're going around and they're getting signatures because they have to have enough registered voters sign the petition to get their initiative on the ballot. And if they're successful, something may eventually be voted on by the general population. So we've had in Missouri, I know there were some this year for, of course, medicinal marijuana comes up a lot, and then also reforms to campaign finance in Missouri was something that also came up this year. Referendum. So this is an election where the state legislature submits proposed legislation or state constitutional amendments to the voters for approval. So something that, the state legislature wants, they're putting out there. It could be something very controversial. Maybe it's a tax increase. And rather than go ahead and pass it themselves, they want the voters to have an input on that. I would say, we see a lot of times propositions. Propositions are like this. So like Prop A was, that had been passed by the Missouri legislature, and now the voters were, voting to remove that. But that had been signed by the governor and was law, or was pending law, and the voters then voted it down in August. A recall election can occur for state offices. You see this most often with the governor's positions where voters can remove somebody who's sitting in office from office, so they can recall them from office. This does not happen for national offices. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about primaries and caucuses for the presidential election. So there are several types of primaries. I'm going to talk to you about the winner-take-all primary, the proportional primary, or a caucus. States have their own, every single state has their own process. So it gets very confusing. There's a patchwork of laws. And within one state, you may have different processes because the Democrats do one thing and the Republicans do something else. So the party leaders within each state have the right to make the rules about what the elections look like. So let me walk you through these types of elections. So I should say, the reason we have a primary is because presidential candidates, when they're trying to become the candidate in the general election, are competing for delegates. Delegates are people who attend the national convention that's held every time we have a presidential election. Delegates cast their vote for the presidential candidate who they want to appear on the ballot. The delegates typically reflect the way the people vote in a particular state. Most delegates today are selected through primaries. So really, it's sort of like the Electoral College. When you vote in a primary, you're voting for a candidate, but really what you're voting for is the delegates who are going to go vote for that candidate at the National Convention to say, yes, this delegate should go ahead and place their vote for this candidate at the National Convention. So first, the winner-take-all primary. This is typically the Republican Party's preferred method. So every state has a particular number of delegates for each party. And the candidate, whoever on the ballot for each party wins the most votes in that state, will secure all of that state's delegates to the National Convention. So kind of like the Electoral College, the winner take all, no matter how slim the margin, they get all the delegates. So if you've got, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, and Trump, edges out Ted Cruz by 2 percentage points, doesn't matter. Trump gets all of the state's delegates at the National Convention in this system. Republicans favor this. The reason they favor this is because it eliminates or it shortens that time where you have Republican candidates competing against one another. The primary process can be really difficult for a party because parties want to shorten the time that they spend bickering with one another and attacking one another and figure out who the nominee is so they can take on the Democrat. So this gets the process over quickly. When you award more votes with each primary, you're going to see them more quickly coming to a conclusion and figuring out who the nominee is going to be. So it quickly enables the candidate to amass a majority of delegates. So there's some rules for this that changed in 2000, and I'm going to post an article for you to read. After 2012, Republicans changed some rules about this. So what happens now is states before March 14th have to use a proportional system where they award delegates proportionally based on the percentage of votes. After March 15th, really they have the option to then use the winner-take-all. Each state has the option to use a winner-take-all primary, and almost all of them do. All the states that have their primaries after the March 15th deadline. So remember, the primary process begins, when we have a presidential election, it's beginning, a year and a half in advance. So January, February, we really see the primary season picking up. The Iowa caucus is usually sometime in February. That is the earliest event that occurs in terms of selecting delegates and kind of kicking off the primary season. And then you have many states who have their primaries right around that March 15th deadline or right after it. Okay, so Democrats don't like this as much. They say this is less representative, and so they typically use the proportional system instead. So the proportional system then is where, you have to have a threshold percentage of votes to win any delegates, and it's proportional to the number of popular votes you win in any given state. Democrats use this in many state primaries. Typically, the threshold is 15%. So if you had any number of Democrats on the ballot, whoever gets at least 15% is going to get that proportion of delegates for them at the national convention. This is a very fair way to allocate delegates, but it can really lengthen that presidential nomination because it's much harder to obtain a majority, and it takes longer. Another note about the Democrats, Democrats used to use superdelegates, and this recently changed. So, this is all this nice slide about the Democrats using this nice representative process. Well, superdelegates there were about 700 party leaders, and these leaders would show up at the convention and they were given a vote, and these people could vote for whoever they wanted to, regardless of who was winning in the state contests. So this was a major problem for the 2016 election because Bernie Sanders was winning many states, or he was winning many votes in many states, and however, party leaders in the DNC had all already pledged their support to Hillary Clinton. So those were people who were going to vote for Hillary Clinton regardless of of how many votes Bernie Sanders was getting. So this put Hillary Clinton at an advantage. And so this has been since done away with. So Democrats kind of realized this is not representative of voter preference. It was probably discouraging to many supporters of Bernie Sanders. I will post an article about how this changed as well that I want you to take a look at. This is a pretty significant change. The caucus, I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. So the caucus is sort of the oldest, most party-oriented method of choosing delegates for the convention. This used to be a closed meeting of party activists who would get together and they choose the nominee. Today, it's much more open. They attract many members of the party. I'll post an article for you to read about the Iowa caucus rather than explain it here. But typically, people gather and it's like a meeting where they work to eventually choose the nominee for their state or the candidate for their state. I'm going to stop there, and I will post some articles for you to continue looking at, and I'll finish this up. I just have a little bit more. I'll do that tomorrow. All right. Have a great